I remember that at one point I asked the English teacher if I could read The Lord of the Rings. He was like, I'm not sure if that's literature. Dark asks, when did you become obsessed with books? The moment I knew how to read. So, by the way, for those of you who are joining me right now, this is my Ash Wednesday. It's onion soup. Homemade onion soup. So I was a library child. That was my happy place. I lived in I think I explained this 2 weeks ago in the live stream, but I grew up in a family with 2 other kids, and with lots of noise. These were cheap houses, and my dad used to play the bagpipes, and he had an organ upstairs, and my brother used to play piano all day long, and so there was always noise in the house. And what I didn't know at the time was that I had ADHD. And so I get very quickly overwhelmed and stressed out by too much, going on. And so I would always go to the library, and I felt so safe there, and it was always very quiet. It was at the time that you could only whisper in the library, and they had carpet. So it was like this really cozy place, and it was built in the 70s, so everything was kind of with wood, and it's not like modern libraries where it's all very cold, and no, this was like such an awesome place. And I just would read and read and read and read every single moment. I would stay there until they would really close the doors and they would kick me out. So that's where my obsession with books come from. And then for years I have not read a single book, and I blame secondary school for that. So once I entered high school, we in the Netherlands we learn a lot of languages, and for every language you have to read a specific number of books from literature, and you are forced to read like real literature, not fun books, no, books that are important. And so I took all the languages that we could get. So obviously Dutch, which had the largest list, and then English, French, German. That was it. Yeah, well, Latin and Greek didn't have a reading list. And so, but I especially German, oh my goodness, we had to read all these depressing, like post-World War II books, and really, really disliked German post-World War literature. It was so depressing, and there was always this coercion. You had to read these books, and I didn't enjoy them, and so that kind of destroyed my love for books, because we had to read so many of them, but we could never choose something that was fun. The English teacher, if I could read The Lord of the Rings, he was like, I'm not sure if that's literature. And then after secondary school, I entered seminary, which was not seminary as you see in many countries, where you're kind of like in a almost like a monastery setting, and everything, all the courses are given inside the seminary. No, I was just basically a university student, so I was studying philosophy for 4 years, and later 5 years of theology, and I lived with other students, other seminarians. So we had the spiritual life in the house, but then we would still study at the university. For a master's in philosophy and later on a master's in theology, we also had to read a lot, but it was all textbooks. But again, lots of lists, and there was just so much to read. There was no time to read for fun. And so that prolonged period in my life, I just barely read anything for fun. And then I became a priest. And then once I was a priest, I felt like I don't have time to read. Read is a luxury. Reading, that's what you do when you're retired. I need to be useful. I need to pray. I need to go and administer sacraments. I never took time for myself. Even like I was very active on social media. It wasn't called social media at the time, but my hobby was to write a Star Wars blog about the prequels. So I'd spend a lot of time on that. But of course, that too, in a certain way, for me, was a way was outreach. It wasn't fully a hobby. It was also work. And then later on, of course, that kind of turned into my work. It's like that's what I do right now. It's 100% media work. So when was my love rekindled? That was actually when the Harry Potter books came out. At the time, I was studying in Rome, and I think several of the books had already been written, but I thought those were children's books. Then I saw the first Harry Potter movie, and I just fell in love with that world. I was like, oh, I need to read these books, which was what I did. And I was so happy. I was like, this is what I did as a kid. This was my happy place. Why did I give up on books? And so that's when kind of like it was almost like a conversion. And so after I read the Harry Potter books, I went back to Tolkien. I reread the Lord of the Rings. I read a few other books, but then things started really accelerate during COVID. When the pandemic was there, of course, I had much more time because everybody was at home. I was at home. And so, and that's when I discovered the Goodreads reading challenge. And I had never heard of Goodreads. And so I remember that I logged every book that I had. I put it in Goodreads. And that's when I realized I've only read maybe 10% or less of the books that are in my bookcases. Why? Because all those books, I bought them not because I like to read them. They were study books, they were textbooks, they were, and so that was also why it was so easy to get rid of them. Like, I'm never going to read these books anymore. So I might as well just switch completely to ebooks, which is what I did. And then I think about 3 or 4 years ago, I started to enlist for the Goodreads reading challenge. Because that kind of worked for me. It's like, I need to challenge myself. I need to have a goal. And it's like running a marathon. The moment I decided I want to run a marathon, or my first decision was not I want to run a marathon, but it was I want to run a half marathon. But I knew that goal setting was, for me, worked as a really good incentive. So I figured I might as well do that for books as well. So I think my first challenge was 50 books, I think. Or maybe I didn't even set a challenge. Maybe I just tried to read as much as I could. And then the next year, I think at one point, it became serious when I said, I want to read 50 books. And I started to figure out how to make that happen, because that basically means I have to read a book every week. And so I started to be very deliberate in planning my reading times. And I would mostly read in the afternoon after work. I hadn't discovered audiobooks yet. That came the next year, because the next year I was like, okay, 50, did it. Now I want to read 100 books. That means 2 books a week. And so, but at that time I discovered audiobooks. And we have Audible over here, but we also have a European audiobook service, which is called Storytel. And it was very affordable. I think it was less than $10 a month. And you can basically read all you want. And they have a huge catalog. So the cool thing about audiobooks is it tells you how many hours it takes to read it. So that for me was a way in which I could plan it. I knew that if I went out for a run for an hour a day, I would basically be able to read a certain percentage of a book. So I was able to predict how many books I would read in 1 week, which is what actually brought me to 100 books that year. And then last year, was it last year? I think it was last year. or maybe a year, maybe 2 years ago, I decided, you know what, 150 books. Yeah, let's do 150 books. That's 3 books a week. Should be feasible. And so that proved to be really tough, especially the first year. So I remember in the last week of December, there was this frenetic race against the clock to finish reading all those books. And I had forced myself to write a review of every book that I read, to hold myself accountable, to show my followers that I was actually reading these books, but also because it helped me to retain better what I liked about it. It makes you read differently if you know that you have to write a small report about it. But I made it. I read, I think, 3 books on the last day of the year. And then, okay, I was like, I'm not going to be able to go beyond 150 books. This was so tight. So I think that was last year. I also set myself a goal of 150 books. And this time, there was no problem. Because by then, it was so ingrained in my system that I was just addicted to reading books. I would just sample anything, and it's all like not just fiction, just every genre, literature, even like the classics, which now I enjoy because I get to choose what I read and what I don't read. So I was actually surprised to rediscover a couple of books that I probably have read when I was 16 years old. And only now I'm like, yeah, now I'm at the age where I can appreciate this. Don't force kids to read books that they don't like, please. So anyway, and this year, total disaster. I hadn't read anything in the first 6 weeks. And that was because I decided to write my own novel. And writing was I'm totally new to writing. So that took every single bit of time. But then about 2 weeks ago, I decided this is not working. I need to also feed my soul as a writer. And so that's where I made a change. I was like, okay, I'm going to slow down the pace of writing and I'm going to make more room for reading. And so now I am in a race against the clock. I'm 19 books behind. But I've been behind way worse in the past. So I will probably be able to catch up and get current in, I would say, a month. Give me a month and I'll be done with reading those 19 books plus whatever extra books I need to read. And I have to say, so I started to read the books that I mentioned earlier. And it is like, oh yeah, I miss this so much. I love reading. Even if the books are not always that good. Because so far, my ratings have been pretty low. I was all around like 3 stars, 4 stars. I've only read one book that I gave 5 stars. And I don't think it was a fiction book. So anyway, it doesn't matter. I'm going to read some more books that I will also review while reading them. So I want to read The Way of Kings, which is by Brandon Sanderson. It's part of the Cosmere series, but there is a special name for the books that he's writing right now. Anyway, it's a very popular series, and I quite like Brandon Sanderson. It's not always, sometimes it's a bit slow, but all in all, it's pretty enjoyable. So I want to read that because I know that there's a lot of interest. So that's I'm reading that also from a, let's say, strategic point of view. And this is also why I read The Fourth Wing. And I'm currently reading Iron Flame. It's not because I'm not part of the target audience, but I know that a lot of people read those books. And so I know that if I read them and I comment on them, I will reach a lot of people. That's what you do when you grow your channel. And it's still kind of like fantasy for beginners, so it's not completely outside of my niche. And as always, it depends on how you read. So for me, Fourth Wing was very instructive because I was analyzing also why does this book work and what doesn't work, at least what doesn't work for me. What can I learn from this and what would I do differently? And this is a kind of for me, it's a really fruitful way to read books because it informs me and I learn to listen to myself and reflect on why something works or why it doesn't work. This is also why I want to do those video reviews, because it gives me some time to formulate what I like about the books and also what I would write. And since I'm obviously still writing the first draft, having read a couple of very well-known books, but also I'm pretty critical of Assassin's Apprentice, for instance, I would write differently. I would definitely make different choices. And that's all gain because I don't have a writing coach. I don't have a writer's group. So I'm basically... English is not even my native language. So, of course, for conversations like this, I manage. But writing is so much harder because the bigger your vocabulary, the more eloquent you are, the better you're going to write. And of course, in Dutch, I would have probably already finished my book because I'm pretty good at Dutch because it's my native language, right? With English, it's much harder, but it's a challenge. And as I told you, challenges work for me.